All right, welcome. My name is Walker Wright. I'm the policy lead for NG Storage and a strategy director at NG North America. Just quick background on NG as we get into microgrids, and I would love to hear everyone's definition on what a microgrid is as well. But NG is the largest IPP in the world, and they're sort of very based out of France, very quickly turning around that Titanic, investing in what we call the three Ds of decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. And obviously that will play very much into the conversation that we're going to have today. In the last few years, NG has been selling off a number of its generation assets around the world and reinvesting that in the three Ds here in California. There's a formerly Green Charge Network, an energy storage company, is now NG Storage. Optera, or the former Chevron Energy Services Group, is now NG Services. We recently acquired EV Box in the Netherlands, and they're coming over here and now rapidly entering the California market. So in many ways, California, and specifically the Bay Area / PG&E service territory, represents the future of the 3Ds. And for a company that's in about 80 countries worldwide with 150,000 employees, it's a really big deal to constantly be pointing to California and the leadership and the innovation that's taking place here. So I very much look forward to having this conversation, and I think that we're really lucky in the sense that we're going to get to talk about this movement towards microgrids from the perspective of the utility that is seeing so much of this movement over the last few years, a developer, a company that's trying to provide that value proposition to the end customer, and then also a very well-known end customer in Kaiser Permanente, which is really executing on this and setting an example for the rest of the corporate world. So I'll allow the rest of the panel to introduce themselves quickly, and we'll start with David, who will actually tell us what a microgrid is.
You go first.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wasn't quite expecting that. Anyway, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Rubin with PG&E. I think my bio, along with the bios of the other panelists, are in the agenda, which I guess nobody has cell service in this room, so you're not going to be able to see anyway. I'm currently the Director of Strategy Formulation at PG&E, and I'll skip everything else on my bio just so we can spend as much time as possible on this topic. So I would imagine there may well be a different definition of a microgrid for just about everybody in this room. What we tend to use as our operating definition is consistent generally with the Department of Energy's, and you may be familiar with that, which is, I'm going to paraphrase, a collection of loads and different types of either generation and or storage devices that importantly can operate in grid connected or in grid disconnected mode. So not everybody holds to the last part of the definition, which is a microgrid is capable of operating in islanded mode, but I think that's an important distinction from what might often enough be conflated with a microgrid, which is a collection of different types of generation and storage resources. We have a lot of that on our grid. We have over 350,000 customers that have on-site generation in the form of solar. A number of customers now are installing storage as well in order largely to take advantage of energy bill savings. But generation and storage is a necessary but not necessarily sufficient condition for a microgrid. In order to take it to a microgrid, you need fairly complex and somewhat costly controls and separation equipment, and a lot of our customers, I notice when they have some form of generation and storage installed, will say, okay, now I can move forward with a microgrid. And once they investigate all of what's involved, and by the way, I don't want to sound like there aren't good opportunities for microgrids, but it's not as easy as might otherwise meet the eye to move from generation and storage into a microgrid configuration. But I'm sure you can convince me that in fact it's maybe easier than I'm expecting it to be. So that's a little bit of a background around microgrids. The way that we look at them at PG&E is essentially under three different types of configurations. So starting, for those of you in the audience, on the far left of the screen, virtually all of the microgrids within our service territory, which is Northern and Central California, are single customer side of the meter types of installations. And so historically, healthcare facilities and or critical care facilities of different types have installed different forms of backup generation in order to be able to operate when the grid is not available. What's newer today relative to what has historically been the case is that the generation more and more is going to be of a clean form as opposed to a diesel backup generator. And there will likely be some storage installed as well. But again, these are typically healthcare facilities, maybe police stations, firehouses, military campuses, some Silicon Valley campuses that are now installing, again, all of the various pieces of equipment that you would need in order to allow the facility, if the grid is down, to operate in islanded mode. So far left, single customer side of the meter installations. The middle will be relatively rare, but still we're looking for opportunities where we have a load or a collection of loads that are located perhaps a distance from the main grid, or maybe our grid connected today, but we need to install some replacement equipment that might be expensive. And it makes sense for us to consider, as part of normal regulated utility service, perhaps serving these loads with self-contained in-area resources. So one example that we're working on now that's highlighted again in the middle column is Angel Island, which is located in the middle of San Francisco Bay, and it's connected to Tiburon through a sub-bay 12 kV line that at some point is going to need to be replaced. And the price tag of the replacement is sizable enough that it looks like it may well make sense for us to look at all on-island resources. The load is about 100 kilowatts plus or minus. So again, you can, under today's economics, look at installing on-island generation plus storage so that when the cable does ultimately fail, the island will be capable of operating as an island, electrically speaking. The last category over on the far right seems to capture most of the discussion time at events like this, but the number of examples are relatively rare. We don't have any operating in our service territory at this point, but it's an area within our built-up grid where a number of co-located customers that are not behind a single retail meter would potentially be connected through some sort of a utility-owned set of infrastructure that would be capable of being islanded as a collection of loads as opposed to, again, a single customer. So again, this is discussed quite often when you find yourself at different microgrid events, multiple customer microgrids. It is, again, somewhat complicated to try to work through the details of which customers are really the ones that would need to stand up in the event of a grid outage. But if you do find a collection of loads that are going to be serving some sort of a broader public purpose, like a collection site in the case of a natural disaster, again, police station, firehouse, community collection center, and where it makes sense to look at installing various types of sectionalizing equipment as well as generation and potentially storage in order to provide the capability to have this grouping of customers be islanded and then work through the details of cost responsibility. We are working to try to find those types of situations. We do have a project that we're currently involved with up in the northern part of our service territory with a group of customers at or around the airport in Arcata, where you have a number of different customers that are on essentially an electrical cul-de-sac on our grid. So it's a line segment that dead ends at the airport, but there are a number of customer loads, and we're working through the details of how we would allow that line segment to be sectionalized and operate as a standalone grid section, a multi-customer microgrid. So again, those are the ways in which we tend to categorize microgrids in our service territory. Different types of physical, electrical, and tariff conditions will apply to each one of them.
So wonderful overview. Thank you very much. And I really like the visual here. I think we agreed not to speak too much to slides, but this is really helpful to get things going. And then if we transition to Gridscape, Paul, when you're out there talking to customers, providing a value proposition, how do you see the market developing? And also, please provide some background on yourself and sort of why you're so excited about this market these days.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vipul Gaur, Gridscape Solutions. Pleased to be here today and so excited to talk to you all about our company in Microgrids. So Gridscape is a clean technology company. We specialize in deploying solar emergency microgrid systems that David just mentioning, the behind the meter type of microgrids, the first category. And we specialize in critical facilities, so firehouses, police headquarters department, critical care facilities, hospitals, some of those. And uh, the value prop for our customers is basically threefold. There's energy savings. Clearly there is energy savings when you put solar generation at the site, and also basically put a storage that goes with it, so you balance out the demand charges for the customers. So on grid mode, energy savings is the biggest driver. And then all of these cities, especially in California, and now outside of California, we're even seeing traction in the East Coast now. Grid resiliency has become a big part of all of these deployments. So whenever there is a disaster, they want to basically island the facility and run it in clean power. Each of these cities and uh, companies that we talk to, they have a sustainability goal. They have a climate action plan. Kaiser being one of them here. Seth will talk about in a minute. But in order to achieve those goals, you have to deploy this thing. And so combination of energy savings and the grid resilience is really driving the market for us to deploy these systems out there.
And over the past few years, I mean, how have you seen the demand change? Are customers asking for more charging stations? Are they ready? Are they more interested in battery storage at this point? What are you seeing in real time?
All of it. Again, it's in California. It's really prominent that because there is a big penetration of electric vehicles in California. Um, you see a need for electric vehicle chargers. You see need for battery storage. There are a lot of good incentives in the state as well. When you go a little bit outside of it, the incentives dribble down. But then there are different types of incentives, especially in the East Coast, where they value the grid resilience in a different manner. So we see all of those in our deployments.
And before we go on to Kaiser, if you could identify a few sort of barriers that you see, whether they are regulatory, price, technology understanding, like how far are we along the curve at this point?
Sure, no, great question. So technology-wise, I think we have the technology needed, the solutions needed. Um, the biggest issues that we see is, there are barriers in actually adopting, the economic model that the cities want to adopt to basically deploy these systems. How would they pay for it? There are PPAs and savings agreement available today, so we leverage those. There is not a way, unique way or identifiable way to actually measure grid resiliency, although they pay for diesel generators and they pay for all the offset. So we are working with some of the cities. There are innovatives. There are cities in the forefront. They are driving some of that policy. Other barrier we see is just the deployment and the permitting issues. Not all the cities are familiar with these systems, and so we have some challenges over there. Um, on the interconnection side, we especially in PG&E area and even in Southern California, Edison, we have had not that much difficulty. Obviously, we have to follow the CPUC regulations and the policies that IOUs have here. Outside of California, we have some challenges in actually getting the interconnection agreements as well with some of our customers. But I think those are kind of the challenges that we just see.
That's really helpful, thanks. And it's a great transition to Seth, who has been seeing this market develop a long time, and he's really in the unique position of the customer, and at a major company with buildings all over the place and managing hospitals. So it gets very serious very quickly. And if you could provide some background on how you've seen the market change and sort of where it's going, and then also just the responsibility of managing all these hospitals and what you see for microgrids.
Sure. So I'm Seth Baruch. I'm National Director for Energy and Utilities for Kaiser Permanente. Most of you know are probably familiar with Kaiser. Some of you may even remember us. So we're a very large integrated health care provider. We both providing the health insurance and the medical care. Kaiser owns and operates 39 hospitals. The vast majority of those are in California. 21 are in Northern California. And Kaiser has around 680 or so medical office buildings in California, and then there are the data centers and the administrative buildings. So there's a lot of buildings, a lot of people, a lot of facilities managers, and the where I sit is National Facility Services. So we work with not really on the medical side, but we work with the regional and local facility operators to initiate national programs. The one that's most relevant for here today is on the energy side, and so we are installing on-site solar. We have national programs to install carport canopies in as many places as it's economically feasible. We are installing fuel cell generation where it's economically advantageous, and battery storage as well. What drives this is a commitment that the board of directors and the CEO have made, and that is to be carbon neutral by 2020 and what we call carbon positive by 2025, which is to say we will take out, our actions will take out more greenhouse gas emissions than our facilities put in. So the interim goal, it gets to 2020, we're basically doing as much renewable energy procurement, energy efficiency as we possibly can. And so we have these master agreements to install the solar and the battery storage. As of so far, with one exception, which I'll get to, is that these are third-party owned and operated facilities on Kaiser properties that when the grid goes down, the solar goes down. When the grid goes down, the fuel cells stop operating. They are grid parallel. And that has been sort of the standard practice that we're looking to change and alter. And the first place we really have tried this is, well, I guess you could say that Kaiser has 39 microgrids because every one of our hospitals has backup diesel generation. But clean microgrids, we have one, and that is at a Richmond medical facility. This is a project that we did in conjunction and funded in large part by the California Energy Commission, which is actually the first. It's called a microgrid at a hospital in California. It's regulated by a state agency that regulates all hospitals. This was a big deal for the industry and for us. It consists of 250 kilowatts of on-site solar on the top deck of a parking garage, 1 megawatt hour of battery storage, and of course diesel backup was there previously. This is the first case that at least that we're familiar with where if the grid goes down and the backup generators don't trip on, which can happen, that this microgrid facility will operate and will provide a modicum, and I say a modicum, of emergency care service, potentially indefinitely. Mostly lights and alarms and sort of we're not at the level of islanding an emergency room or an operating room yet, but this is sort of what we see as the first step in an evolution for really being able to operate, let's say in the case of a natural disaster, potentially indefinitely if diesel fuel supply, for example, is interrupted. So this has generated a lot of buzz around Kaiserland. So we've a lot of facility managers at other hospitals have expressed interest in learning about how we did this and what some of the issues and challenges were and how we might be able to replicate this. So that's just sort of an overview or a background on our program. You asked about the sort of where you see the market going. I think that battery costs coming down is going to be is really encouraging. We've done a few very small scale storage projects. We have been talking to battery suppliers and say, hey, if you've got a site over here that's really interested, but the demand charges aren't really quite high enough, let's talk in 18 months. When battery prices, they see the battery curve, they see where it's going. This will be very important for us to deploy battery storage at beyond the dozen or so facilities that we're looking at right now. The economics of battery storage are not as compelling as some of the financial benefits we're seeing with on-site generation like solar and fuel cells. And so therefore it's a challenge for us to get facility managers at Kaiser hospitals excited about it because it takes up their time to go figure out where the thing's going to be located and all this disruption planning. So being able to improve the economics is important. The other major market development that's at least driving the discussions I have with Kaiser folks is like you've got these on-site solar resources. our calculation for the economic benefits, you can kind of throw out the window because we were projecting 4 years ago that the peak demand or the time of use charges would be highest at 2 in the afternoon. Well, now they're going to be at 6 in the evening. So why not have energy storage to optimize the generation resources that you, facility manager X, have at your facility? That's been, I think, very helpful in terms of accelerating the conversation with storage at places where people are just they're healthcare providers, right? They're facilities managers. This is not what they do. So anyway, that's I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's some great background, and I think we're in a time of flux. Obviously, the time of use has been, I think, a major story within the development world. We have NEM 3.0 just around the corner at the PUC, and the hot topic in Sacramento is obviously the CCAs, who's paying for the grid, and just going back to some of these inflection points. So if we're talking about the value proposition for a customer, we're talking about what they are, right? Whether it's savings or resiliency, and then the next step is from a utility perspective, how do we measure the value to the grid as a whole or the ratepayer with increasing penetration of microgrids? If we're mostly talking behind the meter at this point.
So, hearkening back to my earlier comments, again, and you've all reinforced the same sense, right? That a lot of customers are installing on-site generation, typically renewable, mostly solar, and or storage as a bill savings mechanism or as a way of managing their load and managing their bills. And so, we have a very large penetration of on-site solar. About 20% of the total rooftop number of rooftops are within our service territory. The issue, though, of going from that to a microgrid in terms of what the incremental impact on our grid is, it's relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
Again, because it's really only a microgrid, so to speak, when it's operating in islanded mode, just to distinguish it from normal grid-connected solar and or storage. So a customer that's looking at managing their own bills in blue sky conditions, grid-connected mode, is able to take advantage of the financial incentives under net energy metering, and they're able to manage their either demand charges or time of use energy consumption with their storage. So taking the extra step to install the capability within that particular installation to actually operate in standalone mode when the grid is down doesn't necessarily make any additional meaningful impact on our grid. If the customer is motivated to take that next step, it does obviously provide them with the capability of continuing to stand up when the grid isn't available, whether that's a natural disaster or some other type of grid outage.
That's great, and in terms of the value proposition, Seth mentioned the continued declining cost of batteries, and in the storage world, from an energy storage perspective, we definitely look at all those curves, and from a policy perspective, where I sit, I say, yeah, but we're still in the infancy of understanding permitting of storage. We're still in the infancy of cost of capital. We still have a long way to go on interconnection to really. There's a difference between the cost of what we see the headlines of Tesla's factory. They're getting cheaper and cheaper to make, but that doesn't translate always from our perspective in terms of customer adoption, because the installed cost is still too high. And if you could provide any background on that from a gridscape point of view and sort of where you see that going, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so the cost of battery is certainly going down. We deployed, just like Seth's hospital microgrid project, we deployed 3 microgrids at fire stations in the city of Fremont, and there was 30-40% cost difference between the first battery I procured for the first fire station and the second and the third I procured. And now we actually deploying 10 more systems in next 12 months, and the cost has gone even further down. So I am certainly a believer that it's going to get to a grid parity very quickly, especially when it comes to that small to medium CNI type of customer in energy usage profile, which traditionally ends up paying a little bit higher demand charge. I mean, for Kaiser, it's a large company and large enterprise, multiple buildings, so their energy usage and cost would be quite different than the thousands of the smaller ones that we go after, and so they end up paying incremental more cost, and the cost of the battery and solar is already down there. It's just getting there, I believe, in about next 18 months to 24 months, it should get to the parity level where it should be affordable by any facility of that size who has a reasonable energy usage to basically deploy a microgrid that produces energy savings and grid resiliency both.
That's a great frame. And just Seth or Vipal, just if you could share your thoughts on traditionally, we've been very siloed industries in terms of going to the customer, whether it's storage or a charging station or solar. Do we need to be more integrated at this point, or do you think that it's fine, sort of a little bit of both, more of a hybrid approach?
I can take that. I absolutely believe integration is important, and the reason is this: based on the even previous panel discussion, it was very clear that as the EV scale, the EV charging infrastructure scale, different type of EV charging infrastructure scales up. There are different types of issues that will occur on grid interconnections and grid control and load side. And now with microgrids coming up, that integration is really required. There will be spots and locations where you will see all these different types of renewable distributed energy resource assets coming together, and intelligent software will basically try to manage and optimize that site, making sure that the grid is also stable, it remains stable, as well as it provides the services and benefits to the end customer. So I certainly see that more and more EV charging. I mean, I do see that in our customers. When I deployed the microgrids at the fire stations, I mean, Gridscape has a deep background in electric vehicle charging infrastructure business as well. And when we deployed the microgrids at the fire stations, there was no talk about EVs before. When I started putting the next microgrid, the sustainability manager of the city came to me and says, "Can you lay the conduits for the EV chargers?" Now, when we are doing the next 10 microgrids, each of those microgrids have a line item to put electric vehicle chargers in those sites. So solar canopies, storage, chargers, it just makes sense.
One of the debates we have within our little team is, do we execute on something now or wait for a couple of years when a better solution might come along? And if you do that, then you've got a couple of years of not having your solar or your EV charging, whatever. So, inevitably, the solutions keep getting better as we execute. But a few years ago, when we made this decision for the on-site solar program, there really wasn't a really convincing integrated solution out there. So we did the solar, we did the fuel cell, we're doing the fuel cells, we're still doing the solar. It would be great to do it all as one integrated initiative. It just hasn't really been feasible, at least from a contracting perspective, to find one entity that could really do it all and convince us that they could do it all. Again, I think that's changing. And I think the nice thing about Kaiser is that it's always building new buildings. And so it's either meeting the needs of expanded membership or replacing older buildings. So as we look at buildings that are in construction and design, that's really the opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork for all of the aspects of the solution. But when we first started each program, they had to be siloed because the solution providers weren't integrated.
That's helpful. And Seth, you definitely have experience in politics, local energy issues. I mean, from a Kaiser perspective, or just like if you could provide some background on what is the social impact locally of microgrids as they continue to proliferate.
Well, I guess the way I answer that, speaking as a Kaiser employee, so Kaiser really tries to focus on what they call total health, which is not just providing for the immediate medical needs of its members, but also the long-term needs of the communities that we serve. And so from a social perspective, and that's really what has driven the climate change policy and program at Kaiser, is climate change is affecting the health of our members right now, and it will only get worse over time. So doing our part is, in terms of trying to be a leader on this issue, in terms of what we can do to mitigate our own carbon emissions, is a very important component of what we do. The sort of just the tangible benefits of having carport shading, so customer members and employees can come in and not have their cars be 120 degrees when they get out. The solar canopies have a great branding component to it that unfortunately the fuel cells and the batteries don't. They're just not quite as visually impactful. In any case, all of that, just leads, creates the message that we are, very sustainability minded, that we make the connection between environmental issues and the health of our members, and in the healthcare industry are doing as well. So it's the social component is an important part of it, and I do think that when I've spoken at a number of city council meetings when we go and we ask for the permitting or the variance or whatever we need to build a solar facility. We get a lot of support from local leaders. We explain the connection between our sustainable energy work and climate change and the health of our members. And we're very tied in and integrated with the communities that we serve. Kaiser really sees itself as part of the community. So it's all very much one part of one story that we can tell.
That's great. And I wanted to open it up to the audience. There's a lot of ways that we can go, but I think that these topics are certainly following up with the rest of the conference.
Yeah, with regard to storage, there's been a lot of talk about other potential revenue streams as far as grid support functions like power smoothing and harmonic voltage regulation and harmonic smoothing and things like that, that may be able to be translated into revenue streams down the road, but they haven't really panned out yet, so they don't add to the economics of batteries. Are there any of those that are more likely to be monetizable, I guess, on the horizon? And can you speak to any of those potential grid revenue support streams, either by the individual owner or by an aggregator?
Yeah, I can give a shot at it. So we see that at least today, the value stacking, basically, in California, there's CAISO that basically regulates that market, and you basically have an agreement with them for deployment of storage assets across all of your customers, and you can aggregate them. The most tangible value added service that you can provide today is demand response. So that is available, and you could basically use the excess storage capacity in demand response. When you get to above certain level, then voltage regulation and frequency regulation is also available. We see that in PJM territory in New Jersey, it's actually a well-defined service for those revenue stacks. But in California, CAISO is still formulating some of their plans for that. So you need to have minimum amount of storage deployed, and then you can basically kind of stack that up. Other services are still yet to come, in my opinion. Like for example, grid resiliency, and there are a few others that that probably would just be rolled out over some time. I would like to also get PG&E's perspective on that, if there is any.
There is.
Yeah, go ahead.
So again, not necessarily a microgrid, but certainly storage, when it's grid connected, has the potential to provide a non-wires alternative if in fact we're looking at replacing equipment and or putting in new equipment in order to serve increasing load. We have a project that some of you may have heard of in the Oakland area now, where a jet-fueled power plant that has been in operation for close to 40 years is expected to retire at some point. And so we recently got approval from the California Independent System Operator to move forward with a program where we will be looking at acquiring services from various types of distributed energy resources, including storage amongst others, to help provide a solution for when that fossil fueled power plant does retire. So in other words, instead of putting in either a replacement power plant and or a new transmission facility, we're looking at various types of distributed resources that will provide us with what amounts to a replacement for an existing power plant. So that's an exciting opportunity to be able to use, again, different types of capabilities coming off of distributed resources in order to help avoid or defer an investment in conventional infrastructure.
I have a quick question about energy storage at a very small scale. Sometimes we talk about building decarbonization or fuel switching. And some folks or businesses who would be interested in doing that are reluctant to fuel switch because natural gas is a very reliable fuel. And if you have a power outage, if there is some kind of a disruption in the electric grid, you can always heat your water, heat your space, you have a backup fuel. Can storage be employed at scale and broadly, but in small places, homes, businesses, neighborhoods, to mitigate against power interruption? And can that eventually be a cost-effective solution for intermittency, power variability, or local resiliency?
Yeah, absolutely it can. Gridscape is very active in the small uh, and medium commercial and industrial customer base, small buildings. Um, some of them may have demand charge, some of them may not have demand charge. And in that space, we absolutely see that, storage is a good source just to do exactly the way you asked. And the economics, as Seth said today, they are not working out. It works out for a certain segment of customers in that whole available market, but I think it'll get there eventually, very shortly. And I mean, especially I live here in the Bay Area, and now you even actually see advertisements on the television saying that you can get a battery for $30 a month, and it will serve as a backup system. Tesla Powerwall also advertises the same thing, so it's coming. We do actually see some of the newer buildings that are coming up. In the spec itself, they also basically spec and say that we need to have the storage installed in the building, and so on. So it's happening.
I mean, I'll just add at this point. I think it's interesting that the major solar companies are really beginning to consider themselves and call themselves publicly solar plus storage companies. You're seeing that happen at the trade association level, and then when we talk about wholesale market development, everyone is very excited, but also patient. I'll stress patient with the news out of FERC, and I was in Washington D.C. A few months ago on this on how we're going to develop over time with the various ISOs, aggregated storage markets where aggregations of storage can participate in the wholesale market. So very exciting, but we're also just telling ourselves, be patient. It's going to take time, and it'll obviously take time to get on the more local level. But I think that it's a bright future indeed, while at the same time we're constantly reminding ourselves that the behind the meter storage market is tiny. You always have a conversation in storage, sort of, where is storage compared to solar? You hear that every day, right? And I think there's different metrics, but one of them is like in California, even it's still sort of pre-CSI days, right? In terms of penetration, in terms of the level of subsidies that are out there. So that just gives you a hint, and then across to the rest of the country, it's not really happening beyond isolated cases.
So there was a comment alluded to earlier about CCAs, and I'm going to take that a step further, and I think some of you may know where this question is going, but now that some of these technologies are actually getting to the point where the costs are dropping considerably, what's the prospect for cord cutting? And at least for David, what's your concerns around that, and how are you thinking about it?
So it seems like there are two different questions. I don't know that there's necessarily a connection between CCAs and cord cutting, so I'll maybe address the second part of the question. So right now, the grid, and we believe this will probably be the case well into the future, but it's anybody's guess. The grid is a critical element of the various types of things that our customers are putting or taking advantage of in terms of new electric technologies, whether it's electric vehicles, storage, on-site generation, what have you. We're working hard every day in order to continue to improve the grid and its capabilities, and again, minimize the number of times that a customer would want to have a microgrid because the grid is available. So there have been a number of studies, you may be familiar with a number of them, around grid defection, and what will be the level at which you would find the cost of on-site generation, likely combined with storage, would enable a customer to be disconnected 8760. We don't see that happening likely anytime, at least in the foreseeable future. Again, the grid's a useful battery in and of its own right, and right now under different types of rate structures, it's pretty cost effective relative to all of what would be required in order to enable 8760 islanding. There will be some, I mentioned in that second column on the slide that I showed, there will be some cases where the customer is located a sizable distance from the grid, or there's an expensive upgrade that's required in order to be able to continue to provide a grid service. And if the load is relatively small, it might make sense to develop a totally self-contained solution. But it doesn't look like the numbers of those types of circumstances are large. But again, my crystal ball is probably as cloudy as anybody's here, so I'm open if other people have a different view.
I agree with David. I think grid is the most stable, and it's been around for a long time, and it's been providing power. And I think there are lots of times during the day when it's the cheapest source of energy. I mean, sun is solar is intermittent, even so is wind, and so you need the grid. The real challenge and the idea is, as this DERs actually proliferate in the whole grid, then how do you balance the power out at any point of time? And that's why localized pricing gets important. So there's more of data and more of analysis that is required to kind of figure out what is the most cost effective source of energy at that location or geography at any point of time. And that depends on many factors. It depends on weather, it depends on the tariffs, it depends on the availability of the feeder circuits in that area, region, everything, right? So it's but the grid is here to stay, in my opinion.
Hey, thanks for the panel. This is very good. This is Raj from Duke Energy, out of Charlotte, North Carolina. One quick thing, I agree with the comment as well. We are utility provider, and then my point is reliability, right? So that is the key, especially when you bring that and then think of it as an insurance in the long term. So I agree. As being a utility, we hear the same thing. Of course, we are way a little bit behind compared to other states, but that's one quick thing. The question that I have for the panel is the negative power pricing because of the renewable energy, especially in the middle of the day and shifting peak and all that, right? So are you guys seeing the battery kind of replacing some of that or filling that gap and trying to make that neutral? Or are there any attempts in that area to close that gap? Because if I'm the ratepayer, I would be very unhappy, to be honest with you. Why would I pay the neighboring states? To me, it's like lack of planning, lack of whatever. So what is the battery really feeling there? Because I think that seems like a viable alternative. So if the panel could comment on it.
I'll take a first stab. So again, we're steering a little bit away from microgrids, but so be it. Yes, we do have the phenomenon that I think most of you in this room are familiar with, the so-called duck curve, the fact that we have a lot of must-take resources during the middle part of the day in a variety of different generation forms, but most notably a lot of new solar that's been connected to the Cal ISO grid. And as a result, we've seen negative prices during a growing number of hours, and we expect to see that continue. And storage is identified as one of the number of different solutions in order to help do a better job of managing, balancing supply and demand so that you don't see a situation where you need to curtail resources, particularly clean resources, which would be a shame. So battery storage is one way of addressing that issue. I think many of you might also be aware that there's a consideration of further integrating the Cal ISO grid with neighboring state grids that have different time of day characteristics of load and supply, and that would be another way. Now, again, that's arguably moving in exactly the opposite direction of microgrids. It's extending the macro grid, which is one of the benefits of the macro grid, is the diversity of loads and supply as you continue to integrate different areas. So storage is not going to be the only solution to dealing with the mismatch of supply and demand, but it certainly is one that is going to continue to grow in importance.
I can add a little bit to that. So to help us get to our zero carbon goals, Kaiser is an off-taker under a virtual power purchase agreement with a large solar facility in Southern California, and we see the curtailment, we see the negative pricing. And we are examining the possibility of working with the developer there to install on site a large scale battery. That's still being discussed, and the economics are still kind of on the edge, but we think that will be, especially with declining battery prices, will be a longer term solution for a lot of these utility scale, particularly solar facilities that are facing this duck curve situation.
And just from an NG Corp perspective, I mean, one of the big pushbacks against renewables for many years has obviously been intermittency, leading to a number of the issues that we're talking about here, and that's why developers out there are simply considering themselves, solar plus storage or wind plus storage developers. That's the way that they're thinking about this going forward, and that's only going to increase over the next number of years in front of the meter. And then I think behind the meter, there's different parts of the country where customers have far less choice than they do in California in terms of adopting renewables and making their choices. And I think that what we're seeing here in California and other states is that, behind the meter investment in these technologies, we're now seeing the real proof that it's leading to significant ratepayer savings in the form of less transmission infrastructure over time. And so that's becoming a more serious conversation, which also lines up with some of the topics of non-wires alternatives that we're seeing. So it's very exciting as we sort of move towards a smarter and more efficient, compared to what it otherwise would be, grid, due to the combination of solar storage, wind storage, and behind the meter investments.
David Caneda, Integral Group. So Peter Turnbull at PG&E makes a pretty strong argument that photovoltaics at residential scale is not very cost effective, and really we should be thinking mostly about large commercial and utility scale. What are your thoughts on that same argument for batteries? Anybody?
Disagree with Peter Turnbull from PG&E? Is Peter in the audience? He's not. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to offer just a very brief comment, and then see if these guys have anything else to add. I don't know what Peter's exact quote is. I don't want to put words in his mouth. Well, I do believe that these various types of technologies, whether it's generation and or storage, exhibit economy of scale characteristics, right? So that if you're just simply looking at what's the lowest cost way of providing clean energy from a renewable resource, I think the numbers are pretty compelling that a larger size, say, solar field in the range of, I'm just going to throw out a number, 20 megawatts, and I know the break point of where you start to go up the cost curve has moved to smaller numbers over time, but you do get pretty compelling economics from that size of a system relative to a 4 kW system on a customer's roof. And I would say, not knowing all the chemistry elements of storage, that you see the same economy of scale set of characteristics from storage, meaning it's a lot less expensive to, say, install it at a substation relative to behind a customer meter. The customer certainly enjoys a different set of economics because they're able to avoid retail rate charges that are based on the bills they pay. They don't necessarily match costs we avoid, but we are sending pricing signals every day to customers to encourage them to do things that may or may not result in the lowest cost resources being added to the grid. But I'll stop there and see if you have anything else you want to add.
I mean, we've had this conversation for years, and I think it quickly gets messy because you're talking about private investment compared to ratepayer money. I'm not talking about the price of wholesale grain and comparing it to Honey Nut Cheerios, right? They're two completely different categories at this point. And if it's private investment that is going on, and right now, admittedly, in California, there's sort of the necessity for the SCHIP, just like 12 years ago there was a necessity for a CSI rebate. I think that things get interesting once the subsidy's no longer there, and it's simply, I'm paying for the right to generate and store my own energy, and that's private dollars going into it, which, like we're seeing, that's then saving big time over time with less ratepayer investment in transmission infrastructure. So I think we just sort of have to put all those factors together at this point.
And
It could. Yep. I would just say from an emotional point of view, and I have a history in rooftop solar before going over to NG, is that there's an emotional tie from the customer to seeing the product right there. You know, it's like when you go by a school and you see the solar on the rooftop, I don't think batteries are as sexy, but it's just sort of, this is mine, and you know, you see the chargers right there. That is something that customers enjoy. Most customers will never see a large solar farm 1,000 miles from here. There isn't that emotional connection, and that could be part of the conversation.
And who can't agree with Honey Nut Cheerios anyway, so. He has me.
I've got one quick question. Looking at other countries for policy or market considerations that might be faster moving, getting to more effective solutions, more effective settings, are there examples that you would point to? And you can't say Germany, and if you go to Australia, you have to point out which state.
So I was recently in Melbourne, Australia, Victoria, and you know, their economics there absolutely makes sense. In Queensland also it makes sense. The utility rates, average utility rates are 60 Australian cents per kilo per watt. So you know, it just makes sense. And there are some other pockets in the world also. It basically makes sense. You know, and then you go to Canada or you go to Northern Europe and those locations. There, you know, the cost of energy is quite cheap. They generate a lot of hydroelectric power. So there it does not make sense. So I think there are economies and there are geographies where you know you will see proliferation of DERs and storage devices and solar coming, and then policy will drive most of it. And obviously, you know, as politician comes into power, you know, they represent people, so it will be a kind of people's interest getting into the policy eventually. It takes time, the whole policy process, but eventually I think it will catch up.
More question back here?
One more question. Yeah, Japan, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a policy perspective, what is nice about working in California, and then is that the question no longer is, are we going to be clean or not, right? It's sort of what the consumer interaction will be, how quickly the transition will take place, and you know, we're seeing a lot of these issues play themselves out in real time, both at the legislature and at the PUC. I think now that I'm spending more time in Texas, I'll say that Texans in energy, they'll say we have true competition here. They wouldn't say that what we have in California right now is necessarily a form of true competition, even with the advent of the CCAs. In the back?
I want to re-ask the CCA question. Feels like an elephant in the room that's not being addressed. And there's an economic incentive and sort of a maybe it's an emotional incentive for CCAs to experiment with microgrids and behind the meter creativity and avoiding distribution charges over time. And maybe not quite yet because they're new, but it seems kind of natural. So I'm curious if you project out in the future a bit. How do CCAs, microgrids, and some of these technologies we're talking about evolve?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Kaiser Permanente has facilities now in all of the CCAs, and so I've been having conversations with them, and are really interested in trying to partner with the CCAs to provide some assistance, some incentive, something to facilitate what we've done in Richmond and expand it. So yeah, I mean, I think the CCAs are a great partner for Kaiser now. Most of our load is direct access, so only in certain areas are we, only for certain facilities are we CCA customers. But I have made the recommendation that we default into that, into the CCA service, and then when we're a big enough customer, then they start calling us, which is great. I think they know that we're interested in doing interesting things and looking at new technology, new approaches. So we're sort of excited about the prospect of being able to work with another service provider, to help us meet our goals.
And I think all three of the examples that I use when I identify the different types of microgrids, we are working with CCAs within those respective areas, because again, the customers are generally customers of the CCA for energy supply. And so we have an important opportunity to be able to partner around us looking for various ways in which we can end up either acquiring grid services or helping to provide a grid type service. And the CCA is carrying the other part of the sort of service continuum in the form of generation. So for example, in the case of the Oakland project, not a microgrid, but a non-wires alternative that I mentioned, we're working closely with East Bay Community Energy because they're going to be looking at various types of services that might be coming off the same distributed energy resource that would be providing us with a reliability service. Same thing is true in the case of the Arcata Airport project. We're working with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority as a partner on that project.
Yeah, I agree with both of my colleagues here. Even in the segment that we are in, the CCAs are, we are in discussions with all of them, and they are interested in basically leveraging the DERs that we deploy part of our microgrids within the service area because they have to meet some local renewable and local content. So that allows them to basically meet that requirement as a CCA.
Question in the back, and then we'll.
I have two questions,
Okay.
but the first one is about microgrids in the context of local governments that want to create them at connecting critical facilities. And right now there's a rule that prevents that essentially, unless those properties are adjacent to one another. So I'm wondering if any of you have thought about that issue and what work you're doing to resolve it.
Hospital side.
The hospital side, yeah, I mean, yeah, all of our hospitals are fairly far apart. So we're looking at microgrid hospital by hospital.
Yeah, we also have not come across that kind of situation where, most of the facilities are kind of spread out on different feeders. So, they are independent behind the meter microgrids. But it'd be interesting to see if we are posed with that challenge in future.
And then we had worked with San Francisco under a Department of Energy grant about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where they were looking at adjacent facilities within the city. For example, again, police station, firehouse, school that could be used as a critical care facility in the case of a natural disaster that could be connected to the same circuit or might be currently connected to the same circuit. And the challenge that we faced when we looked at a variety of different types of installations was that it was rare that there weren't other loads interspersed in between the projects that you wanted to continue to keep powered up during an emergency, so that, again, the delicate challenge of balancing supply and demand became much more complicated when you had a number of customers that weren't part of your resiliency scheme, that you had to try to figure out a way, how are you going to ask a particular either commercial establishment or set of residential customers to power down. So the difficulty is finding that alignment of adjacent loads that are on the same circuit or could be put onto the same circuit without having other customers interspersed in between.
With that, I'll call an end to this lively conversation. Thank you very much to our panel and also the great participation from the audience. This is great.